Now we are at the time to start. I see the number of participants is at 38, which is a little bit low for the moment. Some more people, I suppose, may be figuring out either what time it is or how to get on. I will send around a message afterwards because I got mixed up on the syllabus. We should have started with Chronicles last week. I had thought I had cut Chronicles from the syllabus when we cut a class before break, but I hadn't. So we will back up and do Chronicles next week, on Monday. Okay, I see we are up to 40. So picking up again with Psalms. Now, last day we talked about the Psalms and the kingship. Now, the Psalms, the kingship obviously was a topic that was only relevant down to the Babylonian exile. And those Psalms that we were looking at that spoke of the king as son of God and this kind of thing, those are all early. They're all pre-exilic. But however they were understood in the later period. Now, in the case of the temple, we have at least some old Psalms, I think, but you can't be sure in that case because we did have the temple again in the Second Temple period. And so some of the temple devotion that you get illustrated in the Psalms will still be relevant. And in fact, some of it may be more typical of the Second Temple period. But I want to start with two of the older ones. The first one is in Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of the city. It shall not be moved. God will help us when the morning dawns. Then the nations are in an uproar, the kingdoms totter. He utters his voice, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us, and the God of Jacob is our refuge. Now, that, I think, is a classic expression of the old Zion theology that went hand in hand with the royal ideology that we talked about last day. And the key to it is, they think it's an affirmation that God is in that city. And that's, I think, meant quite literally. You know, in the book of Ezekiel, you have this wonderful scene where the glory of God rises up from the temple and hops up to the Mount of Olives before it takes off. But the idea was that the city could not fall if the God was in it. And that's an old idea. You get that in Mesopotamia back as early as, say, 1900 with the destruction of Ur. And you still get it here, I think, in the Psalms. Now, you see, on the one hand, it's a wonderfully consoling idea. This idea that the Lord of hosts is with us. That's what gives you the expression Emmanuel that we had in Isaiah chapter 7, with the birth of an heir to the dynasty. But the difficulty with it, of course, is that then when the Babylonians come and demolish the place, it doesn't look so good. And this, I think, becomes one of the dilemmas of biblical faith, and also going forward. We'll meet this in the apocalyptic literature too, where there is a strong assurance that God will come to our aid. God will intervene and judge the world. And this is a very comforting belief while you have it. The trouble is, if things don't pan out, then it ends up doing more harm than good. You know, it ends up creating disillusionment. again in Psalm 48. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. In the book of Ezra. Sorry? Yes, this is Psalm 48. Hey, Sarah. Yeah. The city of our God, his holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great king. Now, of course, Mount Zion wasn't in the far north, actually. Mount Zion was right there in Jerusalem. The reason they refer to it as being in the far north is that that's a motif that was associated with the Canaanite religion, with El and with Baal. Baal especially was Baal of the north, Baal Zaphon. And you can use motifs like that to evoke the divinity without them having any kind of literal reference. Now, this one goes on, within its citadels, God has shown himself a sure defense. When the kings assembled, they came on together. As soon as they saw it, they were astounded. They were in panic. They took to flight. Now, what on earth are they talking about? It may be that what they're talking about there is what had happened in the time of Sennacherib, when the Assyrians came up and besieged the city, but didn't destroy it or capture it. Now, it wasn't that the Assyrians came up and saw Jerusalem and panicked and took flight. It wasn't quite that easy. But nonetheless, it survived. And that's probably, I think, what gave rise to what's known as the myth of the inviolability of Zion. And we saw this in the Proverbs. For prophets like Jeremiah, this became a bit of a headache because it was giving people a false sense of assurance. And, it was, in the end, it was no bulwark against the Babylonians. You do, however, get some other examples of temple piety that are, I think, less problematic and maybe hold up better. First one is in Psalm 63. O God, you are my God, I see you. My soul thirsts for you. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. Now, this is something that you get quite a bit in the Psalms, the idea of gazing on the glory of God in the temple. And it makes you wonder, what in fact were they looking at? Now, the glory of God is often imagined as something like a cloud of incense. And, that's indeed maybe the case. A lot of scholars nowadays, more especially in Europe, think there was some kind of statue in the temple before the exile. I haven't been persuaded of that because, we find in the historical books, you get references to lots of things that were in the temple and weren't supposed to be there. There were statues, there were something called asherahs, were poles, and seemed to represent the goddess Asherah and perhaps in some way represent the presence of God. Also, you had cherubim in the temple for a time before Josiah's reform. You had a bronze serpent. And I think that if there had been a statue of Yahweh, it would have slipped out sometime. Somebody would have mentioned it, if only to condemn it. So I doubt that, but nonetheless, there was the sense that if you were in the temple and you looked up where the cherubim were and where God was supposed to be, you could somehow get a sense of the glory of God. And so you could gaze on this, so to speak. Somebody had a question there about an Asherah, I think, right? Wasn't Asherah considered to be the consort of Yahweh? Probably yes. But again, this is never quite admitted in the Bible, and not all modern scholars would admit it. But I think most probably yes. Then the presence of the Asherah of the pole signified the presence of the goddess who was the consort of Yahweh. But what you get in a psalm like 63 is a sense of a deep fulfillment of being in the presence of God. You get this again in Psalm 84. And sometimes they will talk about this as being better than life. Well, fulfillment of life, that somehow or other you kind of transcend the problems of life if you're in the temple contemplating the presence of God. In Psalm 84, how lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, indeed it faints for the courts of the Lord. Now, we have a whole category of psalms that are psalms of ascent. That seems to be songs that people sang on pilgrimage up to the temple. Now, something you've got to bear in mind is that in the ancient world, they didn't have what we call holidays or vacations. So your best hope of a day out was if you went on pilgrimage to the temple. And especially people did this for the festivals. And sure, these were devotional exercises, but they were also the closest thing to recreation that people got. And I think some of that is in the background here. My soul longs, indeed it faints for the courts of the Lord. These are people who had been socially isolated and now are overcoming their social distancing by going up to the temple. Even the sparrow finds a home and the swallow a nest for herself. It's a nice image, I think. The idea of birds actually flying into the temple and making their nests in it. Happy are those whose strength is in you. As they go through the valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs. So again, this is probably a psalm that would have been sung by people going up to the temple on a pilgrimage. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. So there is the sense that when they go to the temple, they can not only get away from it all, but somehow rise above it all. And daily problems and even the shadow of death all seem to fade into the background when they're in the presence of God in the temple. You get, well, let's look at one other Psalm of Ascent, Psalm 122. I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together, to wit the tribes go up. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. So this is what gives Jerusalem its special status, I think. I think to this day, many people feel that way about Jerusalem, that it's kind of a special place. And it becomes a special place because, it has been thought to be the dwelling place of God or the place of the presence of God for a couple of thousand years. And there's a literary critic named Philip Wheelwright who used to refer to symbols of ancestral vitality, meaning symbols that have emotional power because they have been handed down from generation to generation. And that applies, I think, to the holiness of Jerusalem. Now, apart from those, there are a couple of other psalms on the subject of trust, which again I think are among the nicer psalms. Psalms, there are Psalms, as we'll see in a minute, that are kind of problematic. These, I think, are not. Maybe the favorite of them all, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. This, of course, is the worshipper as sheep, who is enjoying the pastures to which the shepherd takes me. You prepare, even though I walk in the darkest valley, the old translation, I think, was better, the valley of the shadow of death. I feel no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And that, I think, is one of the basic religious convictions. The sense that at a deep level, things will be all right, that there is a benevolent power in charge, even though often it isn't so obvious on the surface of things that that is the case. One other psalm of trust, which is another nice one, I think, in Psalm 131. O Lord, my heart is not lifted up, my eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me, but I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with its mother. My soul is like the weaned child that is with me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time on and forevermore. Now that's, that's, if you like, biblical faith in a nutshell. And it's at its best, I think, when it isn't hoping for things that are highly specific, but basically a sense of trust. Now, another category of psalms that comes up right at the beginning are called wisdom psalms. Many of those might be better called Torah psalms, and these are definitely later psalms. The Torah really only dominates Judaism from the time of Ezra forward, I would think. Certainly Second Temple. But what you will find in a number of these psalms is joy in contemplating the Torah. Psalm 1. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread. But their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. Now, what you will also find in these is they are not going to be highly specific as to what you're reading in the law. I would call this a kind of iconic reverence for the law. That, the important thing is to be meditating on the law, not necessarily what you find in it. And we'll see more of that in a minute. They are like trees planted by streams of water which yield their fruit in season. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Now, next week, we'll get to the book of Proverbs, which probably contains some of the oldest material in the Hebrew Bible, but it's kind of the common wisdom. And one of the great obsessions of the wisdom literature is theodicy. In other words, does justice in the end prevail? Because if you look around, very often it doesn't seem like it's prevailing. Very often the wicked seem to be doing just fine. Now, there is an awful lot of wisdom literature that is dedicated to assuring you that that's not the case. That sooner or later, the wicked will get what is coming to them and the righteous will prosper. Now, I think probably the most extreme example of this is Psalm 37. Do not fret because of the wicked, and do not be envious of the wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herbs. But if you skip down there to verse 25, this is the famous verse. I have been young, now I am old, and yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread. Now, I think a lot of people would say that the psalmist hadn't looked very far. This is one of the great problems of religion in general, I think, and it will be addressed head on in the book of Job. Now, Job objects to this dogma, the dogma that the righteous always prosper and that the wicked always end up badly. He didn't manage to kill it off, though. And I'd say to this day, there are probably people who believe in it. But that's one of the more problematic things, I think, that we find in the Psalms, is that this a kind of facile theodicy that insists that, contrary to all appearances, everything works out so that the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer. Psalm 119 is the longest of all the Psalms. Happy are those whose way is blameless and who walk in the law of the Lord. Now, in later Jewish tradition, keeping the law is called halakha. Halakha literally means walking. Walking or going on the way. And so this metaphor of the law as a way of life is basic here. Happy are those who keep his decrees and seek him with their whole heart, who also do no wrong, but walk in his way. Now, it goes on then almost incessantly for many verses altogether, 176. And I wouldn't say there are a lot of new ideas that you encounter as you go along. It's rather repetition. But now, I mean, this too is a kind of religious exercise. And we have it in most traditions. You know, in the Catholic tradition, we have the Rosary, where you just keep repeating the same prayer over and over again. Lots of people pray litanies of one sort or another, where it's the act of praying that's thought to be significant more than what you're actually saying. And here I would say this constant repetition going on for 176 verses is, again, an exercise, you know, in instilling an attitude, instilling this feeling of reverence towards the law. Now, presumably it was accompanied by some kind of observance, but in a way the reverence itself is thought to be the point. Now, probably the most problematic thing that comes up in the Psalms is that a couple of them pray for vengeance. Now, we haven't dwelled very much on those psalms of lament or personal complaints. They're generally asking for deliverance of one sort or another. Many of them are just talking about, oh Lord, rescue me from the deep waters or from the mire or whatever way they put it. But there are a few that go a bit farther. Psalm 58. Do you indeed decree what is right, you gods? Do you judge people fairly? No, in your hearts you devise wrongs. Now, that's quite a remarkable statement at the beginning, and it seems to be polemicizing, you know, against other gods. So that's part of the problem with it. The wicked go astray from their womb. They err from their birth, speaking lies. They have venom like the venom of serpents, like the deaf adder that stops its ear. And then in verse 6, you get the prayer, O God, break the teeth in their mouths. Tear out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them vanish like water that runs away, like grass let them be trodden down and wither. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime, like the untimely birth that never sees the sun. Now, I don't know how well aware you have been of the resources that you can find in the Bible. So, if you know of some people of whom you kind of wish that the Lord would break the teeth in their mouth and let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime, you can pray that in good biblical conscience. There are fine precedents there for it. Another one that probably bothers people a little bit more nowadays, I would say, is Psalm 137. Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, again a famous psalm. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. So supposedly this is a psalm for people in exile, people who have survived the destruction of Jerusalem. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And then it goes on in verse 7. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. Again, a good biblical prayer. We'll come back in a minute and invite you to comment on what you think of it. One more before we do, and that is in Psalm 139. Psalm 139, you can skip down to verse 19. Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O Lord, and that the bloodthirsty would depart from me. Those who speak of you maliciously and lift themselves up against you for evil. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them as my enemies. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Now, back almost 20 years ago now, a man named Meir Soloveichik, who comes from the same extended family as the president of Yale, but one branch of that family was very religious and very prominent in Orthodox Jewish circles. There was a Joseph Soloveitchik, who was one of the great Jewish Orthodox theologians of the 20th century, and Meir was related to him. I'm not sure exactly how. And in the meantime, he has become quite a prominent figure, and the kind of figure who is likely to be on a platform at a presidential inauguration. But he came to IDS for a year or two. I think he did a master's degree with the intention of finding out about Christianity. And at the end of his time here, he wrote an article that was published in the Christian Century on the virtue of hatred. And what he argued in this article was that as he saw it, this was the fundamental difference between Jews and Christians. That Christians say you should forgive your enemies. Now, of course, needless to say, the fact that Christians say that officially doesn't mean that we all do it, but that at least this is what we profess. And Soloveitchik said, that's way too easy. He had a story about a Nazi hunter, I think it might have been Simon Wiesenthal, who was called to the bedside of a dying Nazi who was now repentant, presumably, and who at least who wanted to be forgiven before he faced into the afterlife. And Wiesenthal told him, you know, God may forgive you, but I can't. That is not for me to do. So Soloveitchik's argument was that there are some things, people, this maybe not be so clear where you draw the line there, but some things should be hated. Therefore, there is a virtue of hatred. Now, and this, he stated, was, you know, the quintessential difference between, or a quintessential difference between Judaism and Christianity. Now, I should hasten to add, not all Jews would agree with that. And whether, in fact, it is always a difference is also quite debatable. I think you're quite likely to find Christians who practice the virtue of hatred, or you might say the virtue of zeal. You know, what he was describing as hatred, or what's described as hatred here in the Psalm 139. Now, admittedly, in the Hebrew, it probably means basically to repudiate, to have nothing to do with it. But you can see that in some of these Psalms, it really does mean emotional hatred. If you pray, "O Lord, break the teeth of the wicked," you know, there's a little feeling in that. If you pray that God take the children of the Babylonians and smash their heads against the rock, there's some feeling in that too. I think hatred is the appropriate name for it. But the question is, you know, is that in fact an attitude that we should be perpetuating? And what do you think of it? Anybody care to comment? You can just, if you are muted, you can just unmute yourself. I think you can unmute yourself. But in any case, I will here try to unmute all for the moment. Yeah.
I was wondering, Professor, if it's, is there anything to do with curses in these? Is this part of kind of a liturgical or part of the cult in some way, that there would be curses as well as blessing?
I would think so. Now, we definitely have rituals. We have them in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where you bless all the sons of light and you curse all the sons of darkness. Now, curses were taken seriously. They were thought to have power. They were thought to be effective. In fact, at the meeting of the Regional Society of Biblical Literature just before spring break, Laura Nasrallah gave a paper on using the Bible to curse. And actually what she was talking about was the use by some pagans in the Hellenistic world who had the idea that the God of Israel was a particularly effective deity if you wanted to curse somebody. So yes, you do get curses. And I think if you pray a psalm that says, "Blessed are you who takes their little ones and dash their heads upon the rock," you are, I think, also in effect praying that that happen. You're wishing that that happen.
The thing is, that I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. They have testimonies there, and one of the reasons this particular image got to me is because it's part of the testimony of one of the people who was in the camps that actually saw somebody do that to a baby. So that really got to me.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, this kind of thing has happened. So it is not here that the Judeans were more mean-spirited than the Babylonians. Not at all.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that means that they should meet the violence that they face with the same degree of violence.
Well, it probably does. You know, you can think, I don't know if any of you saw a movie called Inglourious Bastards, which was kind of imagining what if the Jews had fought back. You know, we'll touch on this again when we get to the Maccabees, where you have an attempt by the Syrian king to suppress the Jewish cult of the time. And there are some people who withdraw to the desert and pray and say, you know, that God will deliver us. The Archangel Michael will come to our help. And then you have others like the Maccabees who say, to hell with that. And if people attack us on the Sabbath, we're going to fight. Now, who do you side with in a case like that? I think you can certainly, it's hard, I think, not to have some sympathy for the militants who do it. But now, that's maybe not quite the same situation as you have in Psalm 137, where it's retroactive, you know, taking the children of the Babylonians and dashing their heads against a rock isn't actually a form of resistance immediately. It's revenge. Now, I should also say that you will get fine expressions of vengefulness in the book of Revelation in the New Testament. So it is not, I don't think Soloveitchik was right that this is a fundamental difference between Jews and Christians. There may be a spectrum, you know, and Judaism may incline a little bit more to one end, but there's plenty of overlap. You can get this attitude certainly in Christianity too. And is there something to be said for it? What do you think?
I have a question.
Yes.
We've talked about how there are different categories of psalms and they're used for different things. Is a psalm like 139 necessarily intended to be exemplary? Is it something that you're supposed to actually, you know, get other people to go along with? And is it something you're actually supposed to act on? Or is it more of venting one's own personal emotions?
Well, I think it's certainly venting one's personal emotions. Now, if personal emotions arguably need to be vented. Now, it is not only in the Psalms. We didn't dwell on this, but you get a good deal of it in the later prophetic writings. In the book of Joel, gather all the Gentiles in the valley of Jehoshaphat. And then, you know, you have an image of God treading the winepress, which is to say, stomping people and spattering blood. Now, it's all very understandable. You know, if anyone who lived through the destruction of Jerusalem probably saw this and worse. So it's very understandable. So, you know, and this is often an argument made, say, in defense of the book of Revelation, is that you need to vent somehow. And you can vent by praying, by imagining, and that's a whole lot better than going out and venting by killing people. And in fact, a lot of times this kind of literature seems to have been used as a safety valve, you know, to let people vent without having recourse to violence. But now there was a lot written, I'd say maybe 20 years ago. There was a little vogue of looking on the Psalter as a book of instruction. You know, that the Psalter is kind of a companion to the Torah. Now, regardless of what the intention was behind a psalm like that, the way these psalms have been used and are used down to the present day is by reciting them or chanting them in a liturgical context. One of the things you accomplish by doing that is you form personalities. Now, you can form personalities not just by telling them explicitly do this or do that, but by instilling in them certain assumptions, beliefs of what is the appropriate way to look at things. So it seems to me, the Psalms have had that function. What the author of that psalm specifically had in mind, I don't know. But I think it was certainly used that way. That psalm was traditionally recited as part of matins in monastic life. The first thing you do in the morning is chant some psalms, and this is a nice way to begin the day. But you see, it does form attitudes, and that I think is what makes it problematic. Does anybody say, well, Soloveitchik was right? And in fact, if you got the chance to pay the Babylonians back, why not?
I don't necessarily think he was right, but I do think there's something to hating what is evil.
Yeah.
I mean, just like we hate colonialism, we hate racism, we hate sexism, and these are despicable things.
You can't.
A strong sense of sin, and so understanding that and knowing, despising what is evil, that's important. But then that's why, it's so radical what God did in Christ. To take on that punishment and to side with the victims.
Yeah, but now, so I think where that comment is going, if I understand you correctly, is that you have to distinguish between hating the sin and hating the sinner. That fair, Gabe?
Well, it's about hating the sin.
Sinner.
Well, it's because, where hating sin often leads us to is realizing that there's a bit of the sin in me.
Yeah.
So realizing that God responds to that in love is a very...
For a lot of people, I don't think that holds true. I think even the attitude, I think, expressed in some of these psalms, do I not hate the wicked, O Lord, with a perfect hatred I hate them. The person who wrote that psalm didn't think there was any of it in himself. And I think that's one of the big differences, that you have to realize that, in fact, that there is some of it in yourself. Now, I see a comment here from somebody that the nuances between the emotion of hate and to repudiate are different. Fair enough, I think. Yes, they are. But I think some of these psalms maybe go beyond just repudiating, that there is some emotion in them too. But I think the distinction in principle is a good one. It's not an easy one to maintain. But I would say, and the reason I put this on the syllabus usually, is that one shouldn't write off what Soloveitchik was saying too easily. Maybe the way we would like to think of it is that we should be concerned with justice, that justice be done. But it's always a very thin and precarious line. I see from Andrew Ogletree, is there an overriding understanding that vengeance is God's alone? Well, overriding for whom? you certainly will find that expressed. This will come up again now with the apocalyptic literature, which is in effect saying vengeance should be left to God. The problem, I think, with that is that if you really believe that God should take vengeance on some people, it may be very hard to refrain from giving him a little help, from giving him a hand. This is the dilemma often of apocalyptic movements. Can you just wait indefinitely for God, or should you maybe, help things along a little bit? But again, I think, the principle, I think, is still a good one. Would I be skeptical then of Christian exegesis that attempts to present the violence in these psalms as a sort of foil to repulse us rather than a prescriptive call? I think that maybe it would be better if we read them as a foil to repulse us, but I think it would be naive to think that that was how they were meant to be used, or that is how they are regularly used. But I think maybe that's still a good thing, maybe a better way to aspire to reading them. Am I missing anybody there who chipped in? I see some comments on the chat, but I may not be seeing them all. And I'm kind of hesitant to press on the scroll button because when I did it before, I lost the picture completely and to go back to square one. So if anyone has another question, speak up. Anyhow, it's something to think about, something to ponder, and we will circle back to it again, as I say, when we get to the Maccabees and the apocalyptic literature, which I think is kind of a locus classicus for the ethics of violence. And, all the major religious traditions have an ethic of violence. And except for extreme pacifists, who have been a minority, I think, in any religious tradition. So it is something to be pondering. So as I mentioned at the past, and I will send a message on it, on Monday we'll backtrack and pick up Chronicles, which I overlooked in the syllabus that was still on the syllabus for last Monday. So we will fill that in on the coming Monday and then proceed from there to Proverbs. Have a good weekend. Stay safe. Look forward to discussing your midterm exams with your TAs and other pleasures that you may have at this time. See you. Bye.